welcome to the National Museum of the United States Navy. I'm David Barker, I'm an educator here. Today we are joined by Beverley Weitraub. She is a Pulitzer-winning journalist. She is a private pilot, and she has a book out, which is called Wings of Gold. She will be telling us about it. She is op-ed in women aviation and has appeared in the Washington Post and the New York Daily News. Beverley holds tailwind complex, high-performance airplane endorsements and has crisscrossed the country in a single-engine prop plane. She lives in New York City. Beverley, thank you for joining us.
Without doubt, the Navy's most ambitious plans for women have been in the flight training program. 6 young women have been selected to pave the way for future women in naval aviation. They are expected to perform the same as men. They go through the same classes, same drills, same exercises, and they fly the same planes. On May 10, 1973, Lieutenant Judith Ann Newfer became the first woman to solo in a Navy aircraft when she took off in a T-34 from the Naval Air Station, Softly Field, Florida.
It was a very good feeling to know that I had actually taken that plane off and brought it back home all on my own. It was definitely a feeling of satisfaction, a feeling of having gotten over one hurdle. And I think it helped to sort of build a little confidence, too, that we are in the program, we can fly the plane, and we are able to cope with the pressures and the rigorous training that we're involved in.
Our Navy's strength lies in the fact that individuals are given the chance to show what they can do. Black or white, male or female, the opportunity is there.
My book, Wings of Gold, is the true story of these 6 remarkable women who carried on their shoulders the fate of the future of women in naval aviation. They were not expected to succeed, and they were certainly not expected to make careers in the military. But from the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment and the end of the draft, to Tailhook, the Iraq War, and the fight to overturn the combat exclusion, the original female naval aviators bore witness to history and made history of their own. They broke down barriers and opened doors for generations of women pilots wanting to serve their country. And many of the challenges they confronted are still in the news today. It's also the story of how difficult it is to turn a big ship like the Navy or any large organization. The women were thrown in cold, unprepared for what would be expected of them. Many men wanted them to fail. But others saw women as an untapped pool of talent deserving of opportunity. Starting with this gentleman, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, the youngest Rear Admiral and the youngest Chief of Naval Operations in history. When he was named CNO in 1970, against the backdrop of the civil rights movement, the youth counterculture, and the sexual revolution, he had a crisis of morale on his hands. The Navy's reenlistment rate, which was normally about 35%, was down to 9.5. He needed to change how the Navy did business. And his method was what were known as Z-grams, Z as in Zumwalt, 121 messages from the top of the chain of command directly to the fleet. One of the first had as its stated goal, restoring the fun and zest of going to sea. Z-grams covered everything from relaxing bans on civilian clothing to allowing alcohol in some barracks, to forbidding punishing men for growing beards or sideburns, to allowing some Navy personnel to ride motorcycles, to calling out deep-seated, ingrained racial discrimination. In August 1972, Zumwalt released Z-gram 116, titled Equal Rights and Opportunities for Women in the Navy, not only because he believed equal opportunity was the right thing to do, but also because it was a potential solution to a serious personnel problem. With the Vietnam War winding down, the Navy could no longer count on men choosing to go to sea rather than being drafted to fight in the jungle. The impending end of the draft meant the Navy would soon have to attract volunteers. And with the expected passage of the ERA, it seemed it would soon be unconstitutional to forbid women from serving on ships, limit them to desk jobs, restrict their promotions, or bar them from most positions of command, including any job that made a woman a commanding officer over men. 2 months later, Navy Secretary John Warner announced that flight training would be open to women. And in a minute, I'll introduce the 6 who became the nation's first female naval aviators. But there are a couple of things I want to note. First is that in this presentation and in the book, I refer to the women by their first names, which doesn't really sit well with me. But they had different last names at different times, and I started writing it that way, and it got really confusing. So I asked the women and their families, and the consensus was that it's not disrespectful to do it that way. And in fact, some of the men are referred to by their first names as well. The second thing is that the women are often referred to as a class, but that's not technically accurate. They were separated from the very start into different squadrons and then different billets. They were very much, why is this not? Lone women in a sea of men. So let me introduce these wonderful, amazing women and a couple of the themes of the book: publicity, as you've already seen, family, and opportunity. Barbara Allen Rainey was an outstanding high school and college athlete. After graduation, she joined the reserves to follow as closely as she could the path of her brother, a Marine helicopter pilot who served in Vietnam. She was commissioned as an ensign in December 1970 and promoted to lieutenant in March 1972. At the time, there were few career options for Navy women outside the medical field, and Barb did not have a nursing degree. So when she heard about Warner's announcement, while serving as a communications watch officer with the Supreme Allied Command Atlantic, she jumped at the chance. 2 years later, she became the United States' first female naval aviator when her father, retired Navy Commander Bill Allen, pinned wings of gold on his daughter. In the recruiting film, there's a shot of Barb kneeling on the wing of a T-34 mentor trainer holding a fuel cap in her hand. She flew the C-1 Trader and the T-39 Saberliner. Tragically, she was killed in a crash in 1982 while working as a flight instructor at Middleton Field in Alabama. She's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. This is her official portrait, painted after she won her wings of gold. It's in the collection at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Judith Newfer-Bruner was the first woman to solo a Navy aircraft, as you saw in the film. She was the daughter of an Army Air Corps veteran who managed a small airport in Ohio. She flew with her dad and his Piper Cub and soloed at 16. But as a Star Trek fan, she wanted to work for NASA and find life in outer space. But after struggling to afford college, Judy was ready to listen when an Army recruiter came to campus and offered to pay for her senior year if she enlisted. She asked a Navy recruiter if he could match that deal, and he couldn't, but the program sounded interesting anyway, so she signed up. She spent the summer between junior and senior years at Women's Officers School in Newport, Rhode Island, and in June 1970, she graduated with a bachelor's degree in the morning and took her oath as an ensign in the afternoon. She was working as a computer programmer in San Diego when word went out about flight training, and it reawakened her interest in aviation. On January 10th, 1973, in a grand ceremony at the Pentagon, John Warner himself signed training orders authorizing Lieutenant Judith Newfer as the first woman officially assigned to U.S. military flight training. These pictures were taken at the Pentagon press conference. And Warner even dragged out a huge set of wings for the occasion. Now, this wasn't the only publicity Judy would be called upon to perform. She and Barb were asked to report to Pensacola early for PAOs, Public Affairs Opportunities. In the picture at the bottom right, they're standing in the sand on the Pensacola obstacle course, wearing heels and white gloves, in front of a wall that would soon be a literal barrier in their path. The women had to meet the same physical requirements as men and all did great in swimming and in survival training, but the walls on the obstacle course were a problem. Even for many men, the walls were a challenge, but the women had less upper body strength to begin with, and Women's Officer School emphasized administrative knowledge necessary for supporting the Navy bureaucracy, not physical conditioning needed to serve at sea or in the air. So the women got remedial training with pull-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, bike rowing, and weightlifting on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and running on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Eventually, the Navy changed some of the physical standards because otherwise they would have lost the entire group. But it was also a test for the Navy, which had just assumed that this kind of strength was needed for pulling a plane out of a spin or dealing with a hydraulic failure. The WASP, The women Air Force service pilots who flew for the Army during World War II had flown every type of warplane the United States produced, and they proved that brute strength was not necessary. But that lesson had been lost, and it had to be learned all over again. When Judy taxied out on her historic first solo, as shown in the film, all of Softly Field came to a standstill until she landed, taxied in, shut down, and shook her skipper's hand. Now, all this publicity might seem flattering, but military flight training is hugely challenging, and there's very little margin for error. For these 6 women, it was an experiment. After 6 months, the program was suspended and evaluated to see if it would continue or if the Navy would pull the plug. If they washed out, it would be the end of women pilots in the Navy for who knows how long. So they had the future of the program on their shoulders, in addition to the usual pressures of flight training, and then on top of that, pressure to do press conferences, appear on TV game shows, and pose for endless pictures. I suspect some of the 26 women who initially applied realized that's what it was going to be and decided they didn't want any part of it. Judy later learned to fly the P-3 Orion and got to see the literal eye of the storm as the first female hurricane hunter. And later, she would fulfill her childhood dream by joining NASA, writing code for the Hubble Space Telescope, and serving as Director of Safety and Mission Assurance at the Goddard Space Flight Center. In 2014, she received the Catherine Wright Memorial Trophy from the National Aeronautic Association for over 40 years of distinguished and historic contributions to aviation. Jane Skiles O'Day was the daughter of a naval aviator and a Navy Reserve Supply Corps officer who both served in World War II. She and her father flew together in a Ford Trimotor and in his Beechcraft Bonanza. But when she was in high school and applied to work the ramp at the airport where he kept his plane, the answer was no. Receptionist was the only job open to a girl. Jane graduated from college and was thinking about law school when a friend of her father's told her the Navy was considering opening flight training to women. She signed up and was in the middle of women's officer school when it became official. The commander there cautioned her to be careful, saying the Navy does not reward pioneers. When Jane was winged in April 1974, her father, Paul, pinned his own wings of gold on his daughter, the first naval aviator to do so. Now, in the first part of the recruiting film, Jane is one of the women being pushed off of a platform into the water. That was an exercise called parachute release. And it simulated ditching an aircraft, parachuting into the water, and being dragged along by the wind. If the pilot couldn't release the harness, eventually the chute would become waterlogged and drag the pilot under. Lieutenant junior grade Jane Skiles O'Day would be the first woman to fly the C-130 Hercules and the first female naval aviator assigned overseas. When she arrived at her squadron en route to Spain, the CO there told her there was only one bathroom, and she was not allowed to use it. This is a story about Jane in Stars and Stripes. Her squadron was nicknamed the Go-Go Airline, and of course, she was the Go-Go Airline girl. Actually, there were 2 bathrooms, one marked officers and one marked men. Jane decided that since she was an officer, she should use the one marked officers. After the first time she walked in on a couple of officers because the stalls had no doors, the skipper redesignated them men and women. Now, until 1972, pregnancy was cause for immediate dismissal from the military. After that, a woman could request a waiver from her CO, and if he agreed, she could continue her career. So you can imagine the tumult when the woman who was told she couldn't use the bathroom became America's first pregnant military pilot. Jane's skipper assumed she should quit, but she and her husband, a crew chief maintaining the planes she flew, decided she should stay. She cobbled together civilian clothing into something that looked like a uniform because there were no maternity uniforms. And by the way, there were no maternity flight suits until just this past summer. Jane caught lots of flack for it, even though it was okay under Navy regulations. She and her flight surgeon decided it was safe for her to fly until her 7th month. Then she switched to a desk job, was promoted to lieutenant senior grade 2 weeks after giving birth to a baby girl, and returned to flying about a month later. By the time Jane got pregnant with her second daughter, she was a flight instructor at Pensacola, the first female flight instructor in the Navy. And she stopped in her 6th month only because she couldn't reach all the buttons and switches in the T-34. That baby logged over 100 hours of flight time. Jane proved it was possible to be a naval aviator, a Navy officer, and a mom, all at the same time. She was one of the first female naval aviators to serve on an aircraft carrier, to land on a carrier, the defining experience for naval aviators, which the women were not allowed to do for years, to achieve command and to make captain. Joellen Drag Osland wanted to be a professional horse show jumper. Growing up at a time when women were not expected to be physically fit and there wasn't much in the way of girls' sports, she rode horses and taught swimming, horseback riding, and skiing. She had no background in aviation and no one in her family flew. But after she graduated college in December 1972, her boyfriend in the reserve showed her a notice about Warner's announcement. On the same day Judy Newford became the Navy's first female flight cadet, retired Commander Theodore Drag administered the oath of enlistment to his daughter at Naval Air Station Alameda, California. Illustrating a news story about the event was this picture of Joellen wearing high heel boots and a miniskirt leaning against a T-34. It was captioned, of course, "The shape of things to come." Now, looking at this picture today, it's pretty cringeworthy, but it really does speak to the times and to the perceptions that these women had to overcome. Joellen was the first civilian female student naval aviator recruit and would become the first woman helicopter pilot. She decorated her flight helmet with flowers. The Navy, she said, didn't quite know what to make of us anyway. Now, carrier qualifying was not the only shipboard opportunity off limits to women. Soon after Ensign Joellen Drag was assigned to her first billet, she found out she wasn't allowed to fly out to ships with her squadron. She couldn't even hover over a ship to deliver the mail. That was because of a law, U.S. Code Title 10, Section 6015. It said, in part, women shall not be assigned to duty in aircraft while such aircraft are engaged in combat missions. The Navy interpreted combat mission to mean any aircraft that could at some point have a combat mission, not that it was engaged in combat at that time. Flying to and from ships was a primary job for Navy helo pilots. Joellen was being evaluated by the same standards as men for work she wasn't allowed to do. She couldn't log flight time she needed to advance, and the Navy was denying itself the services of a qualified pilot trained at great public expense. After multiple letters asking permission to fly to ships vanished up the chain of command, Joellen joined a federal class action lawsuit challenging the combat exclusion. And in 1978, Judge John Sirica of Watergate fame ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and mentioned Joellen specifically by name. The decision wasn't the end of the matter, but it did open the door a bit, allowing women, including Joellen, to serve shipboard. She soon became the first female pilot assigned aboard a Navy ship and was the first female combat search and rescue helicopter aircraft commander, logging 7 rescues. And later, she and her husband, Captain Dwayne Osland, became strong advocates for military women and their rights. Anna Maria Scott was the only one of the 6 not from a military family. She discovered aviation as a teenager when her boyfriend and a pilot friend took her on a night flight around San Francisco. She earned both her private pilot certificate and a bachelor's degree while at college at California, and being fluent in Spanish, she considered the diplomatic corps. But then her father told her he'd seen an article that the Navy was looking for women to fly. She signed on a month after Warner's announcement and reported to Women's Officer School with the other civilian candidates in January 1973. Slightly more than a year later, Ensign Anna Maria Scott would become the Navy's 2nd female helicopter pilot. She flew VIPs all over the East Coast and secretly made some history of her own by hiding in plain sight. A lieutenant commander in her detachment thought that restrictions barring women from landing on ships made no sense, and he took the risk to give her the experience of landing shipboard. More than once, when landing on an aircraft carrier or destroyer, he took her along as crew, clandestinely. She had to stay inside the helo with her visor down so no one would know there was a woman on the ship. Only the 2 of them, she said, ever knew she had disobeyed the law. After putting in her 4.5 years, she left the military and flew all over the world as a pilot for FedEx. Rosemary Bryant Mariner was the last of the 6 to earn her wings of gold, and perhaps the most driven, the most outspoken, and as a friend put it, the most determined to kick open doors, put in a doorstop, and tell others to go through. She was also the only one clearly focused on aviation as a career. Rosemary was the daughter of a World War II Navy nurse and an Air Force captain who died in a crash near Atlanta when she was 3. 5 years later, the family moved to San Diego. One of her favorite pastimes when babysitting her sisters was to bring them to watch jets take off and land at Naval Air Station Miramar. By ninth grade, she decided she was going to be an airline pilot, even though there were no female airline pilots at the time. So she cleaned houses and washed airplanes to pay for flying lessons and earned her private pilot certificate at 17 while still in high school in 1970, the year Barb was commissioned. She enrolled at Purdue University, where Amelia Earhart had once been an in-house expert on women in aviation, and she was the only woman among 20 or so guys at the professional pilot program. She was in her junior year when Warner made his announcement, and a recruiter said she could make the cut if she graduated by January 1973. So she scrambled to finish her degree in just 2.5 years. She tested out of her remaining classes, aided by professors and university administrators, including a female dean who had served in the Navy during World War II. And she earned her bachelor's degree a week before the deadline. She was the first female graduate of Purdue's Aviation Technology Department, with 620 hours in her logbook and certificates up to and including multi-engine instrument flight instructor. 2 weeks later, she was on her way to Women's Officer School amid a storm of publicity about the new prospective female Navy flyers. Johnny Carson talked about her by name on The Tonight Show. She was 19. Ultimately, she would log more than 3,500 hours in 15 types of military aircraft, held a master's degree in national security strategy from the National War College, was a staff member for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and chairman of the Joint Chiefs Chair in Military Strategy at the War College. She was, in the words of author Deborah G. Douglas, arguably the most historically significant woman in American aviation since Amelia Earhart and Jacqueline Cochran. Amelia Earhart, everyone knows. Jacqueline Cochran was one of the founders of the WASP, and at the time of her death in 1980, she held more aviation records than any pilot, man or woman. Throughout her career, Rosemary worked to expand the opportunities available to Navy women, like carrier qualifying, landing a helicopter on a ship, or flying jets. At the end of basic training in Pensacola, depending on factors including their grades, naval aviators were sorted into 3 pipelines: jets, propeller planes, or helicopters. The men with the best grades got to fly jets, but the women got only props or helos. Rosemary would have qualified for the jet pipeline, but she wasn't allowed. Women didn't fly jets. But at her first billet, Rosemary's commanding officer saw parallels between the obstacles Black service members faced in integrating the military and the challenges facing Rosemary and the other female naval aviators. Commander Raymond Lambert was the first Black skipper at Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia. He became her mentor, a pair of firsts, and he provided a roadmap for how the women should band together, network to protect their careers and each other, and document everything that happened for the record. When he needed more jet pilots, he sent a request for all his junior propeller pilots, including her, to do jet transition training. Her orders got lost. But an ex-fighter pilot up the chain of command made sure her orders got found and approved. In 1976, Rosemary became the first woman to qualify in a Navy tactical jet, the A4EL Skyhawk. And by the end of the year, she became the first woman to fly a frontline light attack aircraft, the A7E Corsair II. She learned to fly the A7 in a squadron in Jacksonville, Florida, where the CO was John McCain. On her very first flight, he cut her solo short and had her recalled to the base so reporters could get the story of the lady jet fighter pilot in the next day's paper. Now, for Jane O'Day and her husband, Tom, juggling 2 careers wasn't so complicated because he was an enlisted man who left the Navy when they returned stateside. But Rosemary Mariner and her husband, Tommy, were both officers and naval aviators. Usually deciding whose career comes first is a major issue when the husband and wife were both on active duty. But Tommy realized early on that Rosemary was unique, even though she did not want to be seen as exceptional. And he felt her career should come first. When they retired from the Navy, he held the rank of commander, and she was a captain. Still, he had opportunities she did not. And even as she became the first woman to command an aviation squadron in 1990, she acknowledged that her husband was a window into a world she was not allowed to see. This is from her piping on ceremony at VAQ 34, a tactical electronic warfare squadron in California. And here she is in an A7 with her name on it at VAQ 34. She was a driving force in the battle in Congress over the combat exclusion in 1991 and became a regular commentator on TV news programs, an op-ed writer, and a go-to interviewee for news stories about anything and everything involving women and the military. Captains Judith Newfer-Bruner, Joellen Drag Osland, Jane Skiles O'Day, and Rosemary Bryant Mariner retired in the late 1990s. Judy and Joellen from the reserves, and Jane and Rosemary from active duty. Judy, the first one in, was the last one out. Now, fast forward 19 years. In 2017, Women in Aviation International inducted the first female naval aviators into the Pioneer Hall of Fame. It was the first time they had been together as a group, with John Rainey, also a retired naval aviator, representing his wife, Bob. And there they are, all together. And I'm not sure the timing of this, but on March 19th, Women in Aviation is re-inducting Captain Mariner into the Pioneer Hall of Fame as an individual. And her family and some of the other original female naval aviators will be there, and it'll be quite the celebration. Now, among the cheering audience members were some active duty female naval aviators who 2 years later would fly the Navy's first ever all-woman missing man flyover at Rosemary Mariner's funeral in Tennessee. And they're the flyover pilots. And this picture was taken at the hotel where the guests stayed for the funeral. That's Joellen in the back at the right and Judy next to her. And two over from Judy is a woman named Mary Louise Griffin. And I need to give her a shout out because I couldn't have written the book without her. She was in this second group of female naval aviators, and she was also, actually, she was an alternate in the first group, but the Navy decided it didn't want alternates because it wanted to see what the attrition rate would be, and going down from 8 to 6 is maybe statistically significant, maybe or not, but for the men, it was about 22%, so that was ballpark. So Mary Louise was then put in the second group, and she made her career. She retired as a captain. And she's a centerpiece of the female naval aviator community. And when I put out queries to find the women I wanted to write about, it went out on a listserv and she responded. She put me in touch with some of the women. She said, I have an archive, come visit me and see it. And she opened her home and she opened her archive. We had a girls' weekend with a retired rear admiral, which wasn't intimidating in the least. And she read my manuscript and answered a million stupid questions. And I could not have written the book without her help. And this is the last picture. The current and former generations paying tribute to one of their own. And I think we have a video, one last video of the flyover pilots talking about the previous generation and what their achievements meant to them and to their careers.